Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and we're glad you're all here today. Before we get started here, just a few quick notes. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A function. We will address questions at the end. Today will be two moderators, myself, Matt Gagel. I'm the Director of Programs at Montgomery History, and Miriam Buno will be joining us as well. She'll be handling some of the technical issues that may arise. Again, use the Q&A function and we'll get to questions at the end of the presentation. With that, I'd like to introduce Matt Logan, the Executive Director at Montgomery History.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you all for joining us today. I want to point out that today's program is a partnership activity between Montgomery History, the Montgomery County Lynching Memorial Project, Peerless Rockville, and the county's Remembrance and Reconciliation Commission. All the partners had a role in this, and it is our pleasure and our honor to do this work. I encourage you to take a look at our websites. You see the addresses here. We have a lot of other work that's going on, and I hope that you'll take the opportunity to see some of the other work, to participate in other programs, and frankly, to become a financial supporter. We need your support now more than ever during this very, very unusual time. Today, as you know, as you can read right there, actually, is the first of a two-part program. And it is intended to advance the dual goals of remembrance and racial reconciliation. Today, Sarah Hedlund, Montgomery History's librarian and archivist, is going to be talking about two lynchings that took place in Rockville, one in 1880 and the other in 1896. Tomorrow evening, you'll be hearing from a series of speakers who will describe the lasting effect that white supremacist terrorism had on the community and how it continues to affect the community and individuals up to this present time. I also want you to note that if you can join us tomorrow evening at 7 p.m., that the link that you use to log on to this program will be the same link you can use tomorrow night. This research into these lynchings has been going on for quite a while. It's involved a number of people and partners, and it is also being presented in a variety of different forums. The summer issue of our periodical, it's called the Montgomery County Story, features the entire issue is devoted to the two lynchings of 1880, one of which you'll be hearing about today. It's called At the Hands of Parties Unknown. Sarah Hedlund wrote that as well. If you would like a free copy of this publication, you can go to our website, go to the montgomeryhistory.org, go to the Learn drop-down menu, and there you can either access it through the Montgomery County Story tab or the African American History tab. Also under that African American History tab, you'll also see a section that we've devoted to the research on the lynchings. So not only the stuff that you'll be hearing about today, but also it includes maps. And what I find particularly interesting are biographies of all the individuals, and there's dozens of them, who have been mentioned in the newspaper accounts from that time. So it really puts a personal face on these events. So finally, I just want to point out the obvious, that the accounts you're going to hear, the stories of these lynchings are upsetting, and they're going to prompt feelings of disbelief, of anger, of guilt, of shame, and all of these reactions, these emotions, and many, many others are central to reconciliation. It is a painful process, but a necessary one. And so I applaud you for having the courage to take part today. So with that, I would like to hand this off to Sarah Hedlund, Montgomery History's librarian archivist.
Thanks,
Okay.
Matt.
Yep. Sarah, are you having some
Yeah,
troubles
I
there?
can't get, it's someone else's screen sharing, so I can't.
Okay, let me, there we go. Go ahead, and you should be good now.
Nope, it won't. Oh, here, got it. All right, thanks, Matt. And thanks again to everyone today. This is not the easiest topic to share and engage with, but I also share in respecting everyone willing to show up and listen to these challenging stories. And to reiterate what Matt just said, I know everyone understands this is not a lighthearted topic, and I try to avoid getting too graphic, but there is some degree of uncomfortable violence that I need to describe in telling these tales that may not be the best for some people. So, okay, that said, as you may or may not know, there were actually a total of 3 lynchings that we know of in Montgomery County. 2 of them happened in 1880 and 1 in 1896. The first lynching in 1880 was that of George Peck, a young man from the Poolsville area, but we're leaving him off our list today because we're focusing on the 2 men who were killed in Rockville. John Diggs-Dorsey in 1880, July 1880, and Sidney Randolph in July of 1896. These 2 men died in Rockville because they had been housed in the jail in Rockville. George Peck never made it to the jail. He was killed in Poolsville before he got there. Neither of these men who died in Rockville actually lived there either. John Diggs-Dorsey lived in Darnestown. After he became a suspect and a fugitive, he was hunted for 2 days throughout the county before he was lodged in the Rockville jail. He was only there for a few hours before he was dragged out and lynched. Sidney Randolph was a stranger to Montgomery County. He didn't even live here at all, but he was arrested for being in the vicinity of a crime that was committed in Gaithersburg. And he was also taken eventually from the Rockville jail and lynched. So even though the crimes these men were accused of happened in other towns, their deaths happened in Rockville because they were in the jail in Rockville. You're looking here at a rendering of the Rockville area created by the B&O Railroad Company in 1890 for the Metropolitan Branch Line. Lots of it is accurate to the time, but some of it is what we would call aspirational, in that in some places they're depicting neighborhoods that were planned or intended development, not just what already existed. But generally, it's accurate enough visual depiction of Rockville for our case here. The jail building, which had been built just after the Civil War, was located here, a block behind the courthouse on Maryland Avenue, in the area where the county council building is today. It was a 2-story stone structure with cells on at least 2 floors and living quarters for the jailer. It was sturdy enough, but it wasn't really any kind of fortress. The walls were stone, but the door was just wooden door. And wresting the keys away from the jailer would pretty much grant you access to everything inside of it.
Sarah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm getting a lot of feedback from your microphone. I don't know if you're rubbing against your laptop or something.
Okay, I'll move my hand off of the.
Okay, thanks.
In 1880, John Diggs-Dorsey, accused of a crime that took place in Darnestown, was taken from the jail and marched on foot about a 3/4 of a mile to the outskirts of town on Darnestown Road, Route 28 now, which would then have been just past Forest Avenue. The house that still stands on the corner of Forest Avenue here was on what used to be, it was built in 1879, and in 1880 was probably the last one before you passed into stretches of farmland and trees. So after they had killed their victim, the group of men in the lynch mob, thought to be mostly from Darnestown, continued along that road back toward their homes, leaving the remains to be discovered by others in the morning. So in 1896, Sidney Randolph, who was accused of a crime that happened in Gaithersburg, was taken from the jail in a wagon through the west end of town. And out to Frederick Road, about a mile out of town, heading north towards Gaithersburg, sort of in this area today where this grocery store stands. The property used to be the Anderson Farm property, the majority of which then later became the campus of Montgomery College. The lynching party then dispersed back home to Gaithersburg from there along Frederick Road, having done the deed on the way home, so to speak. Incidentally, the community that they skirted around here was the Black community of Hayti, which shown here is an extension of West End Park. So this is one of those aspirational moments. They clearly intended to remove the Black residents and develop this into another white suburb. So Rockville was a very different place in 1880 than in 1896. That period of time marked an unprecedented amount of growth and development, mostly due to the B&O Railroad's Metropolitan Line, which had been completed in 1873. Here's the Rockville station on that line. Lots of commerce and industry had spread up in the later 1870s already. And by 1880, farmers were using the train to ship crops, grains, and dairy products. And as a result of the increased commerce, businesses began to open up to serve travelers and merchants. So here are some examples of what you would see in Rockville in 1880. This is a close-up of the downtown from an 1879 map. The courthouse, which had been built in 1840, was a frame structure located in about the same place where the red brick courthouse stands today. And according to the report of the grand jury convened in 1880, it was not in such great condition. They published the report that, quote, "We find the records in the clerk's office and registrar's office are insecure from fire. We also find that the petit juror's room is inconvenient, uncomfortable, and filthy. We would recommend a new house or the thorough repair of the old one." So not a ringing endorsement of the courthouse from 1880. The undertaker was W. Reuben Pumphrey, who had a shop in town on East Montgomery Avenue, sort of near where the Regal movie theater is now, near the block or so from the courthouse. And then directly across the street from the courthouse was the Montgomery House Hotel. Not only a way station for travelers, but sort of the gossip hub of the town where you got all the day's news and happenings if you stopped by. So this is just sort of a small flavor of the town, the landscape of Rockville as it looked in that year. The year that John Diggs-Dorsey was transported into late the evening of July 26, 1880, tied up in the back of Zechariah Davis's wagon, eventually the town he died in. So before we share the story of John Diggs-Dorsey, a note about his name. If you read the newspaper articles of this lynching, you'll see him referred to as John Diggs most of the time. A lot of the articles say he had several aliases, John Dorsey, John Williams, sometimes used the name Henry. However, in the 1880 census, he's living near his employers, James and Mary Shefali, and is written down as John Dorsey. That's them on the bottom 3 rows of this census page here. Also, the Sentinel, the most localist newspaper, used Diggs initially and then used Dorsey throughout, suggesting that that's how he was known around here. And several of the Washington papers suggest that he was well known there as John Dorsey, possibly as a part of a group of workers coming up from Washington to work in the county. And as we'll hear later, his father likely lived in Washington. So we don't really know which of the 2 names or 3 names he preferred. He may have been alternately using both. So we use both to try to represent his life and his name as fully as we can. James Shefali and his wife, Mary Melinda Lyle Shefali, who went by Linny, lived between Darnestown and Seneca. Here's a turn of the century view of the intersection of Darnestown Road and Seneca Road, right there where it's pointing to, just north of the Shefali's land, which is here. On the morning of July 24th, 1880, James Shefali went to Beltsville for the weekend on business. Linny was left alone in the house with John Diggs-Dorsey on site to help her out. She had visitors in and out all day. She sent him to Darnestown at some point to get some coal oil. The last person to visit her that night was the neighbor, Amos West, who stayed with her until 11 p.m. And he offered to spend the night since she was alone, but she said she was fine, and so he left. All right, so after Amos West left, according to Mrs. Shafaley, after he left, John Diggs-Dorsey entered the house later than that, locked the door, physically attacked her, and forced her upstairs, where he raped her and held her hostage with threats until the morning. At one point, she tried to escape, and she said that he struck her with the arm of a chair, and her face was beat up and disfigured. He did leave the house later that morning, and she crawled to the West house across the street to get help. Amos West raised the alarm and started a manhunt for Mr. Diggs-Dorsey. So this story was all according to Mrs. Shafaley's account, which was printed with frequent direct quotes in several of the papers, but none of the papers printed John Diggs-Dorsey's side of the story. So a group of men tracked a set of bare footprints on Sunday and thought he might have been headed toward Gaithersburg train station, which is about 7 miles away, and maybe boarded a freight train there heading toward Washington. The postmaster recalled seeing a letter addressed to John Diggs from a John Williams in Washington. They opened it up, and the sender claimed to be Diggs-Dorsey's father asking for money. So based on this information, Sheriff Kelchner and Frederick Shafaley Sr., James's father, went to the Washington police detectives and showed them this letter. Based on that, the police then raided 2 houses late on Sunday night. That one of them, the supposed father of John Diggs-Dorsey, John Williams, and that of an unnamed married woman, they never gave her name, who was supposed to be his sister. They didn't find him there, and they hadn't heard from him lately. So while that was going on, a bunch of rumors the next day flying about where he was and who had found him. But where he actually was found was later on the afternoon of Monday. An old farmer named Zechariah Davis overtook a man walking on the road near Mechanicsville, fitting the description of John Diggs-Dorsey. He apprehended him and brought him in a wagon back to Rockville. Arriving at the jail, that's Zechariah Davis, arriving at the jail around 11 p.m. and turning Diggs-Dorsey over to the sheriff. So the sheriff immediately recognized the danger of an imminent lynching, and he started gathering a group of armed men together to help him guard the jail from a potential lynch mob. Then Davis went into the Montgomery House Hotel down the street and began telling his tale of the capture. As word spread, a crowd began forming in town, but apparently a message had been sent from Darnestown to wait until the husband, Mr. Shafaley, could arrive in town before forcing the jail. So obviously reporters are hanging around town getting all this information. Some of them actually interviewed John Diggs-Dorsey directly while he was in jail, though none of them gave an exact version of his version of the events. A few accounts reported that he gave a full confession to the sheriff, but most accounts state consistently that he admitted the outrage, but vehemently denied the beating or the assault. And some state that in admitting the outrage, he cast aspersions on Mrs. Shafaley, suggesting that he said the sexual encounter was consensual. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Shafaley and the other men from Darnestown did arrive, and along with the rest of the men, they approached the jail demanding to see the prisoner. The sheriff refused them, but the group rushed the building and disarmed the sheriff, and several of his recruits ended up joining the lynching party rather than guarding the jail. All reports state Sheriff Kelchner made every attempt to stop them, but he doesn't actually fire his gun. He later said if the men he recruited had stood firm, they could have held the jail. The men removed Dorsey from his cell and forced him, still in shackles, to walk to a place along the road towards Darnestown. Here's another view of it. The intersection of Bullard Drive and Laird Street, the same street across Montgomery Avenue, there was probably right at the edge of West's property, which is where most articles refer to the general location of the lynching. The group was met there or at a place on the way there by a man on horseback, and the horseman asked all the men present to form a circle and swear an oath not to reveal the identities of each other to protect themselves and their families. Once they arrived at the site, they insisted many times that Mr. Diggs-Dorsey confessed to his crimes, but he denied doing so, denied the charges, and cursed them for what they were about to do. They said a prayer for him, that he would be forgiven for his sins. They saw themselves as the righteous ones, fulfilling God's law as well as man's. There was one last scuffle as he tried to escape one more time, but the noose was fixed around his neck, and they threw the rope over the limb of a large cherry tree and then physically hauled him up from the ground and held him there until he died. The group stayed for perhaps 20 minutes and then dispersed, leaving the body to be discovered at daylight. So the local justices of the peace summoned a jury of inquest the next morning, which met at the site briefly where the body still was hanging. After hearing several witnesses, including the jailer, that he did not know any of the perpetrators, the quote, usual verdict was rendered, that of death by violence committed by parties unknown, and the jury were discharged. The grand jury held later that year in November upheld this verdict, saying we have been unable to find any evidence that would lead to the conviction of the party or parties connected therewith. The same month, the Sentinel got into an editorial flame war with the Baltimore American Commercial Advertiser. The Baltimore American had criticized the Sentinel for disagreeing with the local judge's charge to the grand jury. The judge had condemned the lynching, and the Sentinel had taken issue with that, saying in certain cases, that is rape cases, the law was too slow and inefficient and too lenient to the rapist. Therefore, a man accused of rape should rather be lynched and the rape victim avenged. The American and the judge rightly pointed out that regardless of the heinous nature of the crime, the accused was owed a fair trial according to the law. And the American also pointed out that in many cases, the man turned out to be innocent after the fact. The Sentinel was indignant at that idea and reiterated its views in its next issue. Linnie Shafaley recovered, and the couple continued to live in Darnestown until James's death in 1910. Linnie sold all their property and briefly lived with her married niece in New York, but she died a few years later in 1916. They're both buried here in the Darnestown Presbyterian Church Cemetery, but Linnie has no stone. The lynching of John Diggs-Dorsey was reported in 15 states outside of Maryland, in addition to the local reporting in Rockville, Baltimore, and Washington. Those numbers are referring to a number of articles that appeared in those areas. County would be Montgomery County, regional is Maryland, DC, and out of state is out of state. Comparing that to the Peck lynching 5 months earlier, had only been reported in 3 other states and pretty local, Virginia, Delaware, New York. And you can see the reporting was a lot less in general. So now we travel forward in time. The growth of Rockville happened in a boom during the 1880s. And by the 1890s, land speculators had been buying up farmland and converting it into subdivisions. They touted Rockville as a resort destination. So the Montgomery House still stood, but now even larger hotels like the Woodlawn on Route 28 attracted tourists to the area, which supported even more commerce in town. The Woodlawn Hotel here opened in 1889, went out of business in the early 1900s, and was converted into the mental hospital called Chestnut Lodge. The structure was practically across the street from where John Diggs-Dorsey was hanged in 1880. That property, which had been the outskirts of town in 1880, was now the fashionable West End neighborhood of Rockville, which advertised to white socialites looking for quiet residential living outside of Washington. Businesses in the town were also upgrading their appearance in line with more prosperity and new architectural styles. Mr. Pumphrey's business, which had been a simple 2-story wood structure in the earlier decades, was now operated out of a handsome brick structure, probably with apartments in the upper stories there. And that 1840s era courthouse had been replaced, according to recommendations, in 1891 with a handsome brick tower structure in line with the growing prestige of the town. Several churches and commercial buildings and houses in town sort of echoed that tower peak roof architecture. The jail building, however, had not been replaced. It was the same building in which John Diggs-Dorsey had been dragged from, and that same fate awaited a man named Sidney Randolph 15 years later. So in the early morning of May 25, 1896, in Gaithersburg, an unknown intruder attacked the Buxton family with an axe. The Buxtons lived on the outskirts of downtown Gaithersburg on Frederick Road in Gaithersburg. We know they lived across the street from the Forest Oak Church and Cemetery, so probably somewhere on this property here or just on the folks' property above. The Buxtons were a family of 5. Richard Lemuel Buxton was a recently elected town commissioner who also worked as a miller. His wife, James Anna, was known as Teeny. Daughters Maud, age 16, and Sadie, age 7, and their son Carol, age 3. Also living with them was Mrs. Buxton's brother, Zed Easton, but he was apparently not at home when this incident happened. So what happened was around 4 in the morning, an intruder entered their home, struck a blow each of the adults with an axe, and then struck the children. Mr. Buxton fumbled with his revolver, but it misfired before he could aim it. The attacker also choked Mrs. Buxton and then ran out of the house. All the family members were hit at least one blow to the head with the blunt end of the axe, not the blade, except for Carol, who was reportedly hiding under his parents' bed and avoided injury. The daughters were more seriously hurt, but the whole family was actually conscious after the attack. Buxton and his wife roused their neighbors from the Phoebuses up there and the Englishes nearby, and a doctor was sent for. When asked to describe their attacker, the Buxtons both said it was a tall black man, but could give no further description. So that news spread quickly via telephone at this point, which was relatively new, but pretty well established in Gaithersburg already. And local vigilantes began scouring the area for suspicious-looking black men. So Frank Ward and John Garrett had heard about a stranger walking along the road between Gaithersburg and Hunting Hill today, which is called Muddy Branch Road. Sidney Randolph, in his early to mid-20s, was walking there. According to his story, he had come up from Georgetown the night before. He was a migrant worker, originally from Georgia, but had been working in Pennsylvania and then rotating between the Virginia, DC, and Baltimore area. He said he had slept in a barn the night before, and when the two men rode up to him and started asking questions, he was afraid they were after him for trespassing. You could actually be arrested and imprisoned for vagrancy at this time, which was considered homelessness and or unemployed, either way. In fact, Randolph himself said he had been jailed for vagrancy in Pennsylvania a few years earlier, the only time he'd been in trouble with the law. The men that were talking to him, Garrett and Ward, were not law enforcement. They were just 2 guys on horses that told Randolph he had to come with them. And so he was scared and he tried to get away. So Ward shot at him several times, struck him in the hand, and grazed his thigh, and Garrett ran him down with his horse and tied him up at gunpoint. Meanwhile, the Reverend Lloyd and Detective Sheriff Horton G. Thompson, local men who were self-appointed investigators, followed tracks from the Buxton house to where George Neal lived. Mr. Neal allegedly had a grudge against Buxton for aiding in his incarceration in the penitentiary 8 years earlier on charges of assaulting a white girl. Though it doesn't appear that Buxton was in any position of authority at the time, so we're not sure what his role in that case was. Also, as a point of interest, the deputy sheriff was a first cousin of James Shafaley, who was featured in our previous story. When questioned, Buxton said he knew Neal and he knew he was not the assailant. He said his assailant resembled another local man named Clem Johnson, but that it was not Clem who attacked them either. The Buxtons were transferred later by train to the Garfield Hospital in Washington for treatment for their injuries. So these men were originally taken to the jail in Rockville on the afternoon of May 25th, but they were quickly transported to Baltimore, specifically to prevent a lynching. They were sped through town in a closed carriage on the orders of the sheriff, almost halted by a crowd assumed to be the lynch mob, and were placed on a train at Autry Park Station down there outside of town. So while they were in Baltimore, the townspeople acted as detectives for the next 2 weeks, actually, collecting a large quantity of flimsy and circumstantial evidence based on the rumor mill of a small town. That evidence gathering was especially driven by our friends, the Reverend Lloyd and Deputy Sheriff Thompson. Meanwhile, State's Attorney Alexander Kilgore asked the Washington police for help. Rockville or Montgomery County in general didn't have any police detectives. So he asked the inspector and Washington police to send detectives. So they sent 2 guys, Horn and Whedon, who started investigating the case. They were quickly unconvinced of Randolph's guilt. They didn't think he did it, and they sought to investigate other suspects. The townspeople, though, soon refused to talk to them because they dared to investigate the motives and alibis of the local white men, like the neighbor, Mr. English, the brothers at Easton, and even Mr. Buxton himself. The detectives did not speak in detail to the press about their theories, but they did have theories, but they quickly abandoned the case due to the open hostility of the townspeople who refused to participate and cooperate with them. So following that, Kilgore brought in detectives from Baltimore, who also remained skeptical, but they were lodging with the Reverend Lloyd, so they were probably influenced by his theories, and they thought there was some credible evidence against Mr. Randolph, at least. However, Mr. Randolph lacked any motive for the attack. He was a stranger in town. He didn't know the Buxtons. No one in the Buxtons neighborhood was wealthy, and the houses made that clear from the outside, so robbery seemed unlikely motive. And early on, people speculated that Randolph was in the Maryland penitentiary with George Neal at the same time, that they had met each other there, and George Neal had a motive, so they must have planned it together. Of course, Mr. Randolph was never in the Maryland penitentiary. The wardens in Baltimore verified that, but that sort of association between the two kind of stuck for good. So the townspeople had created some evidence for Randolph's involvement, all circumstantial, but there was no evidence linking Mr. Neal to the attacks. His family members all testified to his presence at the home during the time it occurred, and a lot of his family members who were considered witnesses were actually arrested and imprisoned for the next 2 weeks to retain their testimony, I guess. Sidney Randolph's story that he had come up the night before, was from Georgia, all the things he said he'd never been in Gaithersburg before, that story never varied once this whole time, though he was interrogated, what they called sweated, multiple times that likely included torture. So he never changed his story, but local witnesses, increasing in number constantly, claimed to have seen him in Gaithersburg several days before the attack. The Reverend Lloyd came up with a theory that the shots that he had sustained had not been shot during his arrest, but that he'd actually been hit by Buxton's errant shot in the house, providing this magic bullet theory of ricochets and Kennedy assassination stuff. It was crazy theory. Horton Thompson, the sheriff, and later Benjamin Hicks, placed his feet and shoes into the tracks that Lloyd had followed from the Buxton house days or weeks later probably, and claimed that they fit perfectly. They compared the prints by pressing Randolph's feet into a box of sand while he was in prison. And lastly, after his first week in prison, Randolph was taken to the Garfield Hospital in Washington, where Mrs. Buxton could not identify him at all, nor at that point say whether her assailant was black or white. Mr. Buxton said he thought it was the right man. Neither of them were given alternate men to choose from, like a lineup situation just presented with Randolph. So the situation heightened when Sadie Buxton died from her injuries on June 5th, 1896. Her funeral was held at Forest Oak Chapel in Gaithersburg, presided over by the Reverend Lloyd, and she was buried in the graveyard there. Her death prompted a coroner's inquest, but State's Attorney Kilgore decided that inquest would also serve as a preliminary hearing, since the suspects had been imprisoned for weeks without one of those. And a group of Black lawyers in Washington had taken notice of Randolph's case by this time and were putting pressure on the locals to take the proper steps in investigating the case. So that coroner's inquest / preliminary hearing lasted over 2 days in Gaithersburg, held in Norman Hall in this building. It's the upstairs room in this building, which belonged to John A. Belt. It was originally planned to be a closed affair, but they decided to make it public, and the room was packed to capacity with all these onlookers and pressmen. It was presided over by Curtis Bauman, a local man who's employed in justice of the peace, but of course trained neither in the law nor in medicine, acting as both judge and coroner. He presided over a jury with 5 lawyers present. State's Attorney Kilgore was there. Buxton had hired a lawyer for himself, and there was a lawyer there for Mr. Randolph, Mr. Neal, and one for Mr. Neal's relatives that were all imprisoned. The questions in this hearing were asked mostly by lead juror John A. Belt, who was also providing testimony against Mr. Randolph later, and Justice Bauman also asked questions. The lawyers didn't really speak. So the assembled heard testimony from 37 witnesses. Seemed that their testimony, there were 2 goals in mind. One, to prove Randolph was in the Gaithersburg vicinity earlier than he said, so basically to prove that he was a liar, and also to establish that he resembled Clem Johnson, which Buxton said he thought his attacker did. The last witness was Richard Buxton himself, who fingered Mr. Randolph as the assailant, recognizing him as the man he saw in the hospital. So the suspects were not here. They were kept in the jail in Rockville for their safety. There was no actual evidence provided. This is a preliminary hearing, so there's no physical evidence. There's nothing else provided except testimony. And still, there's no motive for this attack. No reason that it was done by either of these men, really. The lawyers, Ashley M. Gould of Washington representing Randolph and Edward C. Peter of Rockville representing Neal, did not dispute any of the testimony. They later said none of it would hold up in an actual trial anyway, so they just didn't even bother. So the jury, after 30 minutes deliberation, returned a verdict that Sadie had died from a blow to the head inflicted by Randolph. Many of the papers ran a headline of Randolph found guilty, even though this hearing had not been a trial at all, 2 steps down from a trial. George Neal was exonerated and released, along with all of his family and the witnesses associated with him. And Mr. Randolph was to remain in the jail from June until his hearing before the grand jury, which would take place in November. So there wasn't a lot of reporting in the next 2 weeks. The investigation continued, kind of limped along. There were actually rumors that the Pinkerton detectives had been hired to continue it. The papers reported that there was growing doubt, especially outside of Gaithersburg, that Randolph was the right man. Most people thought he was not. But by early July, the story had not been covered at all for many days. So 2 things happened on July 3rd. Maud and Teenie Buxton returned to Montgomery County from Garfield Hospital in Washington. Many people saw them come and felt very sorry for them. And it was also later suggested that a rumor started that Maud had been the target of a sexual assault, being the ulterior motive for the attack on the family, and that this rumor re-inflamed the lynch fever. And others said the lynching was too well planned for that to be a last minute rage action thing, and must have been planned well in advance of the rumor. So also on this day, the Sentinel ran detailed coverage of the lynching of Joseph Cocking, a white man actually who had been indicted for a similar axe murder case in Charles County. His lynching had taken place on June 27th, but had not been locally reported until July 3rd. And then eerily, printed on the morning of July 4, before the lynching of Randolph was known to their editors, the Washington Bee, one of the district's black papers, published this acerbic remark, as if they premonition of Randolph's fate. The lynching of Cocking is an indication of what will be done with Randolph. Randolph is innocent, but someone must swing. So that night on July 3rd, Sidney Randolph was in his cell in the jail building that night when 20 to 30 men wearing red handkerchiefs to disguise themselves aroused jailer Peyton on pretext of having a new prisoner for him and forced him to give up the keys. They opened Mr. Randolph's cell. According to a fellow prisoner, Randolph didn't say anything, but he did scream the word murder over and over again and fought bitterly against his attackers. They literally dragged him out as he attempted to hold onto the floor grating. They eventually had to strike him in the head to subdue him enough to take him out through the back of the property to a wagon waiting near the residence of E.C. Peter, which is across the street from the jail. And he was taken in the wagon about 1.5 miles out of town to this stand of trees near Frederick Road at the edge of the Anderson property. A portion of this stand of trees, and possibly even the very tree itself, was still standing in 1951, as shown in this aerial photo of Frederick Road. The group of men hanged Sidney Randolph from a chestnut tree, didn't give him a fall, but hoisted him from the ground and strangled him until he was dead. Based on the scene and descriptions of the body, it was obvious that his death was slow and excruciating. His body was found at 4 a.m. the morning of July 4th by George Minor Anderson and Benjamin Riggs, who had been woken by the jailer once the party had left town. The two men had followed the wagon tracks leading through West End Park to the scene of the murder, and then the tracks led away toward Gaithersburg. The magistrate summoned a jury, which visited the crime scene with the body still present. The body was then taken to Pumphrey's, weirdly displayed for a few days, and later buried in the Potter's Field at the almshouse. So unusually, the jury did not render the usual verdict right away. This time, the inquest into the identity of those responsible continued in the courthouse over several days. According to newspapers, Rockville citizens were indignant at the lynching in their town, immediately suspecting Gaithersburg men. The testimony revealed the sheriff had no idea that an attack was imminent. He earlier had been moving the prisoner away from the jail every night, but he'd stopped doing so, as the men from Gaithersburg, particularly John A. Belt, had assured him they would let the law take its course. The sheriff didn't live in Rockville, and he had left town at 6 p.m. to go home, so he wasn't present. Several of the Rockville's young men were catching a train that night, July 3rd, the night before the lynching, in preparation for a day of baseball games to be held on July 4th. Some of them heard about the planned lynching before catching the train, and some of them the next morning at the hotel in Frederick. One of them claimed to have heard about the lynching and wrote a quick letter to Kilgore warning the potential plan. Kilgore said he never got the letter. One of them claimed to have spoken to Deputy Sheriff Thompson on the train platform saying, "You shouldn't let them kill that man." And he said Thompson made no reply. Deputy Thompson had received a letter from Milledgeville, Georgia, asking if the man they had in custody could be a fugitive from that area in Georgia known as Ben Temple, wanted for murdering a minister's wife. The masks worn by the lynchers were all identical red handkerchiefs tied by a particular kind of jute twine used almost exclusively by post offices to tie up packages. John A. Belt of Gaithersburg both ran a general store that stocked handkerchiefs and held the position of postmaster for the town. So he was later heard to be very angry at the obvious insinuations in the press that he was involved. However, he was also heard by the jailer threatening Randolph in the jail a few days before the lynching, accusing him of using a false name and saying he hadn't many hours to live. Belt admitted this on the stand. Thompson had obviously shown him that letter from Georgia, and Belt assumed Randolph was actually Ben Temple, the wanted fugitive. Tools used in the abduction of Randolph and found near the lynching site were those issued by the B&O Railroad Company, specifically for the Gaithersburg section of the line. Only men who worked for the B&O Railroad would have had those tools. By the way, John T. Buxton, elder brother of Richard Buxton, worked for the railroad in 1880. And lastly, several people had seen a group of buggies and wagons heading back to Gaithersburg in the early hours of Saturday morning. In particular, the adult sons of G. Fenton Snowfer were seen, particularly disguised, or partially disguised, in a buggy outside Washington Grove around 2 a.m. And also, someone saw them returning early in the morning. Their horses were lathered from exertion. So the witnesses in that story were all Black, and at least one of them was threatened for giving testimony. So this testimony was heard from more than 40 men, some more than once, over 3 sessions on July 4th, July 7th, and July 13th. So initially the investigation seemed robust, and like newspapers reported, that maybe they would identify some perpetrators, but partly due to the big gap between the second and third session, enthusiasm had sort of waned, and in the end, the jury rendered the usual verdict, death at the hands of parties unknown to the jury. So following continued general public outcry and angry statements and threats of action from those Black lawyers in Washington, the governor of Maryland offered a $1,000 reward for the apprehension of those responsible for the murder of Randolph, as well as the lynching of Joseph Cocking in Charles County. A grand jury inquest into the lynching of Sidney Randolph was held in November of 1896. Before which Judge Henderson advised them strongly to, discover the perpetrators. However, they also rendered the usual verdict, taking pains to re-indict Randolph as guilty of the crime. And like the inquest jury, particularly exonerating Sheriff Collier, as in, sorry, I'll get the slide back up there so you can see it. Missed one of my cues there. So the sheriff and the jailer in the Charles County case had actually both been indicted as being responsible for the lynching of Cocking. So the juries in Montgomery County took special pains to exonerate their sheriff to prevent that kind of thing. That's the grand jury report there. So no charges were ever brought in the Randolph case. This was the last they sort of heard about it. So aside from one oral account of the possible existence of a hanging tree on Route 355 that might have been the site of Randolph's murder, the only accounts we have of the Montgomery County lynchings are from newspaper articles at the time, which is what these stories have been based on. Unfortunately, these are highly inaccurate. They're biased, inflammatory, geared almost exclusively to their white readership, but they're all we have in recreating these events. There were large differences reporting these cases between 1880 and 1896. You can see the reporting was much more widespread and detailed in 1896, owing to the proliferation of the telephone and the increasing sophistication of the Associated Press. So the county numbers, relatively the same. The regional number encompasses both DC and Maryland, so you can see a huge increase in that amount of reporting, as well as an increase in the out-of-state reporting. Part of that had to do with the fact that the Randolph case unfolded over about 6 weeks, whereas the Diggs-Dorsey case happened in a couple days. There were also differences in the tenor of the reporting. In 1880, the Baltimore American was one of the only papers that I could find to express a negative opinion of lynchings. Most of the other reports were either supporting lynching or rather indifferent to it. By 1896, there was a noticeable uptick in outcry and censure, both locally and nationwide. So look at the difference in these headlines. In 1880, this headline from the Washington Post creates almost a romantic image of a lynching, whereas 15 years later, the Evening Times headline leads with "life choked out," which is a much more apt description of a lynching. The 1880 headline also refers to the Negro ravisher, doesn't even mention John Diggs-Dorsey's name until well into the article, where the report on Sidney Randolph's death mentions him by name twice before the article even starts. In another example, in 1880, the term brutal is applied to the person, and 15 years later, the same term is applied to the lynching itself. Also notable difference in 1896 is the response from figures with more national recognition. In Sidney Randolph's case, the governor of Maryland, Lloyd Lowndes, got involved, saying, "Such lawlessness is demoralizing to the community and the perpetrators must be punished. There appeared to be serious doubt as to the guilt of Randolph. These lynchings are to be greatly deplored and are a blot upon the fame of the state." He demanded that the authorities in the two counties, Montgomery and Charles County, should take steps in apprehending the perpetrators and punishing them, offering a $1,000 reward for information. Even Ida B. Wells Barnett, already famous for her anti-lynching crusade by this time, commented on the lynching of Randolph directly, saying, "Many a Negro is lynched as a scapegoat for another man's crime. An editorial in one of the papers clearly states that the lynching of Sidney Randolph, the Negro lynched in Montgomery County, Maryland, was instigated by the real murderer of Sadie Buxton. Randolph was a scapegoat." She was so heartened by the outrage engendered by the public over lynchings that she stated in that speech, "Truly the country is awakening, and I predict the early decay of that strictly American institution known as lynch law. My work is done." She was a brilliant woman, but unfortunately, she was wrong about that. The work was far from done. Though Montgomery County saw no more murders that were explicitly defined as lynchings, they continued across America well into the 20th century and beyond. It is a legacy of injustice that has remained with us to this day and has shaped some of the ugliest facets of our country's societal structure. Telling these stories, saying their names, and continuing to confront our uncomfortable history is the task before us. And to that end, our work is never done. This list of people have been amazing, have assisted me in one way or another compiling this research, making sense of it, and I'm very grateful of for their assistance and their knowledge and suggestions. So thank you very much for that. And thank you very much again for your time today and your interest in listening to and sitting with these difficult stories that are part of our county's history. I encourage you here to explore the work of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. They just recently published an updated report on lynchings in the Reconstruction era, as well as these state and local commissions and advocacy groups listed here who are working to embrace the challenge of truth, remembrance, and reconciliation in our communities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. We'll go ahead and take a few questions. We've got quite a few, so we may not be able to get to all of them. I believe you can always contact any of these organizations if you have further questions, and you can see that Sarah Hedlund's email address is there at the bottom. And I'd also, before we get to questions, I do want to remind everyone that we will be having part 2 tomorrow at 7 p.m. And again, use the same link that you used to join today. We're looking forward to hearing more of the story of how the long-lasting effects of lynching in Montgomery County and in our nation. Okay. Let's go ahead and get started here. Again, I won't be able to get to all of the questions. I apologize in advance. We've had many questions. So I will pick some of the ones that I hope are the most relevant. And again, you can always contact Sarah or us at Montgomery History, and we'll do our best to answer those as we are able. Okay, first of all, let's focus a little bit on the search. I believe this was for Diggs-Dorsey. Someone asks, was there violence toward members of the Black community during the 2-day search for the first lynching, or before the lynching?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I think yes. I recall in that case that there were some one-off stories. It was hard to track that because some of the articles didn't mention that. So if only one article mentioned it, it's hard to know how credible that was. But it indicated that they were sort of arresting a number of different men here and there on suspicion of being Diggs-Dorsey. So anytime you have people out on a vigilante hunt for a Black man, I suppose there's going to be people arrested erroneously and treated poorly, likely, while they're under suspicion. So I would not doubt that was the case.
Okay. Can you, I don't know if you can answer this, but can you tell more about the lives of Black people at the time? A lot of context was given for white Marylanders, but is there any more context about what Black residents of Maryland, what their lives would have been like?
Yeah, that's a great question. And with the limited amount of time I had to present these stories, I did have to truncate that a lot, and I apologize for that. Part of the reason is because both Diggs-Dorsey and Randolph didn't really seem to be, well, Randolph certainly, since he didn't even live here, but Diggs-Dorsey seemed to be kind of a, not really involved in any of the Black communities, per se. I don't know much about his life. We can't know much about his life, but it seemed that he may have been living in Washington. He may not have been very involved in Montgomery County Black community life. But at this time, both in 1880 and 1896, as happened much later, the communities in Montgomery County were very much segregated. So there were, all of the stuff I talked about in Rockville obviously would have been white Rockville. There were many, many African-American communities throughout the county. And they had, in some cases, their own, well, they definitely had their own schools and their own churches and their own community life. Not that nobody ever interacted, but there was definitely a lot of separation between the communities. In Rockville, there was a community of Hayti, which I mentioned on the edge of the Montgomery College property there. There was also a community, 2 or 3 more African-American communities right here in Rockville that existed at the time. And in Gaithersburg, obviously George Neal, I didn't get to spend too much time on him, but he was definitely part of the African-American community there, frequently playing baseball games up in Boyd's. There's a lot of, some amount of description of that in there. And like I said, I wish that I had more time to spend on that aspect, but in this case, with our 2 men in particular, they didn't seem to come from those communities too much. So I didn't get a chance to really get into that.
Okay, kind of related to that question, what was the impact of it? Is there any known impact that these lynchings had on the Black communities in Montgomery County?
Yeah, I wish I knew. I have not been able to find anything that reacts to it. Not that there isn't. I've not found it yet. Obviously, the newspapers that I'm finding that still exist were not reporting, for the most part, for the Black community, with exception of the Washington Bee, which commented from a distance. They were in Washington. So there has to be an impact. I mean, both, well, Randolph in particular was killed like right next to a Black community. So obviously there was an impact, and it would be amazing to find a record of that, and either an oral account or some kind of written record. And we're always looking for that kind of evidence for these kind of events. Like I said, I do not take any pleasure in relying on newspaper reporting. So, anywhere out there that has anything else, I would love to see it.
Okay, and before I go on, I just want to reiterate that a lot of, in fact, majority of Sarah's research is available in the copy of the Montgomery County story that is available on our website. If you go to montgomeryhistory.org, and then in the drop-down menu at the top that says Learn, click on the Montgomery County story. You can find a PDF copy of volume 63, number 1, that contains an I don't want to say exhaustive, but a very large amount of this research, probably far more than she was able to address today. Okay, so let's go on here. Are there any known photos of John Diggs-Dorsey?
There are not.
Okay. Was Amos West ever questioned about his part in the Diggs-Dorsey situation? I guess would be a way.
That's a great question. I would have loved to hear from Amos West. I have a lot of questions about his role in all of this, but no, the only account we have of events sort of are strictly from Mrs. Shafali's, from Lenny Shafali's perspective. And if anyone interviewed Mr. West, they didn't print it or talk about it in the accounts.
You mentioned that Mr. Diggs-Dorsey was not guilty. Did evidence come to light that showed he had not committed the crime?
I don't think I said he was not guilty. I suggest we can't know. And they wouldn't have known either because they didn't let it go to trial. So the only thing that suggested something else going on to me was the fact that he suggested that the encounter was consensual, which did happen back then and was often, punished with lynching in that same way. So that stuck out to me just because it was such a typical thing for a lynching story to include. That I've read about, other lynchings across the South and things, but I have no idea if he was guilty or not, and neither did they.
Okay. Do we know where these two men were buried?
Yes, they were actually both buried out at that almshouse. I took that slide out. I had a picture of it. It used to stand out by right where the Montgomery County Detention Center is, on the end of Montrose Road at Wooten Parkway, where that detention center was where the poor farm was. And it was a poor house where people lived. It was also a sort of a potter's field where they buried people who couldn't afford a burial or the criminals. We suspect that since those graves were unmarked, they probably were covered over when 270 went through there and that whole interchange was put in.
Okay. Is there known information about Klan activities in the Rockville area during this period?
During this period, I can't, I don't think so. I think there was Klan activity in the county for sure. I don't know when it was active. That's actually, I was just talking to one of my colleagues yesterday about investigating that, having that be on the list of upcoming things to investigate.
Okay, and just to reiterate, the Montgomery County story does list all of, well, I wouldn't say all, a good number of the resources or the resources that you looked at to create this narrative, correct?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Do you know why the lawyers were not allowed to speak at the inquest?
I don't know that they weren't allowed. I don't. This is another thing that I have, that I've had people investigating kind of for me, people that know the law and the history of the law, although it's a difficult thing to look into because, a lot of modern lawyers, they're not going to study how the law worked in 1896 because who cares anymore, right? But as far as I can tell from the proceedings, I think the point was for the jury to determine the information, which is why the jury was asking the questions of the witnesses. And it wasn't a trial, so there was no evidence introduced. There was nothing, you know, it wasn't like Perry Mason kind of stuff where the lawyers were speaking. I think the lawyers were just there to take notes, I guess, and prepare for the trial, that where they would actually have a role. And I think that this wasn't exactly a kangaroo court, but it's pretty close, like, you know, kind of a local theater production of a hearing, it seems to me. I kind of made it sound like the lawyers weren't allowed to speak, but I don't think that was the case. I think it was just wasn't common. In fact, I'm sure in a lot of those cases, lawyers weren't even there most of the time for much, you know, cases that were not murder. Probably, you know, it was just the jury and some witnesses and the suspect, and that was it.
Okay. Next question here, and we'll go ahead and I'm going to do just one or two more questions as we're pushing 3:15 here. But was death by hands unknown a kind of standard outcome of trials related to lynching, and were any lynching parties ever found guilty?
The quote "death by parties" that's a very typical turn of phrase, I would say, used by juries in lynching cases. That's why I call it, quote, the quote usual verdict. And in fact, papers at the time referred to it as such, that juries rendered, quote, the usual verdict. They used that phrase as well. As far as I know, and this is according to what I've read from EJI, I don't think any white man was ever indicted for the lynching of a Black man in the entire history of the practice. I'm pretty sure that's true. I would have to look it up again to make sure that I'm stating something accurate there. But if not none, certainly almost none were ever prosecuted.
Okay. The next question I have is, I think, more of a contextual time question that you can probably answer. Why was it? Why? Someone asked, why do you call it an outrage as opposed to alleged rape, since he denies it was rape?
So I guess I slipped that term in there just because I'm used to seeing it. Outrage, quote, was often used by the newspapers to avoid saying the word rape. I think they felt it was a little too violent, descriptive to print in paper, so they often sort of, you know, used it as a mask for that. It was supposed to mean that. Later, it didn't seem to be. So, like when the governor is talking about outrages, it was more being used as, you know, what we would use it as. And so I guess I slipped into calling it that because of the time period, partly, and also because if it was consensual, then it wasn't really rape. So when they reported what he said, they literally said he admitted the outrage, but denied the beating. And then went on, you know, to suggest that it may have been consensual.
Okay. Next question. I'll keep going here a little bit because I've got a couple more that are good and relevant. Is this local history available to the public and taught in MCPS?
I don't think it's caught in the schools. I mean, it may be referred to as having happened, but the information is available more so now that we've been doing this work for the last year than it had been before. Certainly people have written articles on this that I had read, and we had a couple articles in our vertical file. It's not a secret. A lot of historians knew about it. It's just not ever, you know, really been in the forefront of discussion for various reasons. But I'm trying to do all this research and keep track of my sources and keep them in a way that they can be re-examined by other researchers who are also interested to know. And like Matt said, a lot of my research is being posted on our website on the African American history page under the button that says lynchings in Montgomery County. There's all of my sources, all of my narratives, all of the biographies on the people, just like Matt said, way more than I can ever give in a talk or a paper, way more information about it. So we're trying to make it available now, more so than it has been in the past.
Okay, so I'm getting a couple comments here about MCPS, and again, I can't speak for every single classroom, and I'm, not everyone here can do that either, but it seems to be kind of a mixed situation. Some schools do teach it, some don't. And again, I don't, I'm not going to go into that's just statement of the facts that I'm seeing. So the other thing I wanted to ask, and here before I have another question that I really want to get to, but I want to just ask, I believe it was for the Sidney Randolph one. You've mentioned in some of our staff meetings that you had just a wealth of sources, but there were some problems with them regarding, let's see, what was it that you've said, that a lot of them are the same report? Can you talk a little bit more about that, but why that happened?
Oh, well, like I said, the whole idea of the Associated Press was sort of up and running by that point. And so especially a lot of the out-of-state coverage, it wasn't really coverage. It was just, like some statement that the Washington Associated Press sent out to all its affiliates, and then they just printed that same thing in all its papers. So there wasn't any new information. And there was a lot of that going around locally too. So in one of the cases, I can't remember which one it was, but the Sentinel, actually being a Friday paper, was like a week behind reporting because the lynching had happened on a Saturday. And by the time they reported the next Friday, they literally just cut and paste entire sections from other newspapers. So they didn't actually have their reporter write an independent report. They just copied from other papers that had already published reports and sort of cobbled that together as a report. So, you spend time reading these, you start reading phrases and think, I know I've read this somewhere before, it's not new. So there was a lot of overlap in the reporting as the reporters were sort of copying from each other and printing what other people had written.
Okay, next question here that I think is a great one. Were these lynchings lost to history or recognized as part of Montgomery County history during these past 100 plus years?
I wouldn't say they were lost, but definitely tended to be avoided, I guess, when talking about histories of the county in general. I think, we also have to recognize that, the interest in this topic is relatively recent, driven especially by the work of the EGI, which is great and it's necessary and it's important, but it was not necessarily the focus of historians on the county in the past. And whether it was just left out because it seemed small and insignificant to the topic that was being addressed, or if it was left out for more deliberate reasons, we can't really know. Like I said, it wasn't a secret. People who study the history of the county knew that they happened. It just wasn't necessarily at the forefront every single time.
Okay. Someone says, one article suggested that Randolph had an accomplice. Was that ever pursued?
Oh, yeah. So the whole problem with Randolph was that he had no motive. And also, I didn't have time to get into it in the story. The Randolph story is so massive that it's really hard to truncate it down to a listenable narrative. The Buxtons were actually attacked, but the English house, their neighbors, the Englishes, their house was actually also broken into that same morning. And so there were thought to be two men involved, like they broke in one house and one in the other. And then once people discovered that there really wasn't a connection between Neil and Randolph, they tried to come up with a different person that Randolph might have been working with to make this happen. So that was kind of an offshoot of trying to make the man fit the crime rather than the other way around. So that's where that came from.
Okay, and I'm going to just do one more question here. We'll start to wrap things up. Before we do, I just want to let everyone know who sent other questions in. I apologize. You're more than welcome to contact Montgomery History, and we can certainly try and address those. Just, you know, we're trying to make sure we focus on these two lynchings that happened here in Rockville. So, you know, there were some other really great questions, but some of them aren't necessarily directly relevant to these two lynchings. So, you know, we can certainly address those via email or some other platform, but we'll go ahead and just do this last question here. Do you think the victims' origins outside of Rockville may have played a role in their lynchings as non-local targets with less community support / resistance?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, the papers sort of, and the group of lawyers that I mentioned in Washington, D.C. Commented on that aspect of the fact that, I mean, the language they used wasn't the greatest, but they referred to Sidney Randolph as a, quote, tramp Negro without a friend. And what they meant by that was that he was, you know, homeless, jobless, he didn't know anybody. He was a completely obvious scapegoat for this crime, and he didn't have any money or any friends to stand up for him in court or in any other way. So all he could do was just tell his story, and that's all that he had. And in the case of John Diggs-Dorsey, I kind of see the same kind of thing. Like I said, you know, I didn't get into the Black communities because neither of them really seemed a part of the Black communities, and John Diggs-Dorsey seemed sort of separate. And again, by himself, working for a white couple, and, you know, who knows what happened that night. But it's really easy to pin the blame on someone who doesn't have anyone, any family or any friends or any community to stand up for them.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone who attended. Again, I just want to reiterate, there's far, far more information available in the Montgomery County story. And even that, I'm sure is, you know, not the complete story, and we may never fully know the stories of these two men. Again, I want to remind everyone that we'll be back tomorrow at 7 p.m. and with some other community members who will be sharing the long-lasting effects of lynchings, of Rockville's lynchings. And again, that's at 7 p.m. You can use the same link that you used to join today. If you have any questions, technical questions, you can send them to historyconversations@montgomeryhistory.org. Those will get to me, and I will try and address those. If you have any issues joining tomorrow, we can certainly help you out. And again, if you have any questions related to this presentation, you can see there on the screen, archive@montgomeryhistory.org. And we will do our best to address those. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. And thank you all for joining us. And thank you, Sarah Hedlund, for taking on this task.
Thank you.
We'll see you all tomorrow.